Hey guys, I've been testing Hu Tao and I guess at this point, she's pretty much considered a top DPS. But how exactly does Hu Tao actually compare against Diluc and Klee? In this video, we're going to be comparing the three and discuss Hu Tao's advantages and shortcomings and see when it might be good to choose her over Diluc and Klee. The goal of this video is to give you a good idea, or at least a rough picture, of how Hu Tao performs as a Pyro DPS compared to Diluc and Klee. I'll also talk about Hu Tao as a whole and share my own personal conclusion as well as give you some tips on improving her efficiency. So I guess this will serve as sort of a Hu Tao guide as well. Before we start the comparison, however, there are a couple things that you need to know. This is not a perfect showcase by any means. It's intended to give you an idea of the advantages and disadvantages that Hu Tao has among the other 5-star Pyro DPS, and give you an idea of what you can expect in terms of damage. The exact damage values and damage consistency might be different for you, and there might also be more optimal ways to deal damage than the ones found in this video. All the characters will be at Constellation 0, and I'll assume you understand at least the basics and elemental reactions. One last quick note, there are no food buffs used in this video. For the first part of the video, we'll be doing a simple damage comparison with all three characters, and for the second part, we'll discuss everything about Hu Tao and compare her with gameplay clips to make it easier to see what I'm talking about. I'll also be using a level 90 Diluc as the benchmark for this test since I've brought him to level 90 long ago, but Hu Tao and Klee are still at level 80 and they're not ascended, so their damage still has room to improve. I'm aware that this means that they won't compare equally, at least in terms of damage, but the damage difference between a level 80 and a level 90 isn't significant enough to invalidate the showcase. It's also the reason why I don't have many characters at 90 or ascended beyond 80. In fact, talent differences are more important since it directly affects multipliers, but I've made sure that they're all at least level 7 and 8, so there shouldn't be any significant differences. All in all, this comparison should still give you an idea of where Hu Tao stands in the Pyro DPS ladder. Now for builds, all three characters are equipped with artifacts that I would build on them for late game, so there are no sets to purely inflate their numbers. All the characters are built with similar stat lines with at least 30% crit rate and at least 155% to 160% crit damage. Some characters may have more or less of each stat, and since artifacts are entirely RNG, the substats do affect the damage values you'll see on the screen, so don't expect the exact same results. In fact, the artifact sets should be the most important thing to take note of since they all run different builds and thus have different effects. You can find the full builds of all the characters in this video at the very end, including support characters as well, just in case you're curious. And finally, since weapons do affect the numbers as well, these are all the weapons you'll see in this showcase. There are also accessible options to give you a better idea of the kind of damage that you can achieve without relying on the gacha, and I'll be sure to go over them as we proceed. Anyways, let's just begin, shall we? Let's start with the most interesting and easiest comparison, the highest single damage value. Everyone likes doing big damage, and Hu Tao does not disappoint. You've probably already seen what kind of damage she can do, so we'll compare using the 3 units highest damage multipliers, but we'll exclude plunge damage for Diluc. I know there's recently a big craze in doing plunge attacks, but let's ignore it for the purposes of this video. We'll be doing this in Abyss 7 just to get that satisfying big damage from the buff. And of course, using Melt and the combo setup of Bennett and Sucrose to deal as much damage as possible. Yeah, we all know what's gonna happen, so here's a point of reference for you. This is the damage Hu Tao can do in the open world with a basic Melt and Elemental Burst. Bennett and Sucrose haven't even entered the picture, and there's no resonance involved either. Now, let's compare it to the 3 within the Abyss. From damage alone, even with Star Glitter, Hu Tao can outdo Diluc's Gravestone by quite a margin. This is simply because Hu Tao's burst has the highest damage multiplier among all 5-star Pyro DPS to date, and it goes even higher when her HP is below 50%. Her passive also gives an extra 33% Pyro damage while under 50% HP, and coupled with her elemental skill to buff her damage for a short period of time. This pretty much lets Hu Tao hit like a freight train. Using Dragon's Bane does do more due to the elemental mastery and weapon effects, but Star Glitter is a perfectly viable option as well. With full HP at talent level 8, her elemental burst has 1.36 times more multiplier than Diluc's level 8 burst, and when her HP is lower than 50%, she'll have 1.7 times more multiplier than Diluc's burst and 2.2 times more than Klee's charge attack multiplier. Klee's charge attack is very spammable though, and Diluc has a lower cooldown on his burst and with a much longer range. But if you want the biggest possible damage, Hu Tao is the one to pick, followed by Diluc and then Klee. But there's more to DPS than just having a high single damage value. In some fights like the Storm Terror for example, you're presented with a small DPS window that you can use to deal as much damage as possible. Of course, having a big instant damage would be the best, but characters without high multipliers can still do a lot of damage within that DPS window. And that's pretty much what Klee is, since her kit doesn't have the multipliers that Diluc and Hu Tao have, but her skill and elemental burst deals damage multiple times to an enemy. So we'll use the Cryo Regisvine to show this, since the boss has roughly a 15 seconds DPS window from the time the crystal breaks until the initial recovery animation. What we're testing for specifically is if they have the damage to clear the boss before it recovers and takes less damage. We're not going to be testing their clear times, although it's something that you can use as reference as well. Also, we'll be running a different team this time and put Xingqiu in as our Vaporize support, with Ember to help break the crystal and for Pyro Resonance. Xingqiu is a very good support for these Pyro DPS characters, as he actually provides off-field support and a good damage multiplier with Vaporize. For the weapons in this showcase, we're only going to be using the craftable weapons. As you've seen, all three are more than capable of clearing it within the DPS window, but as expected, Hu Tao had the least issues due to her kit that's pretty much designed for a quick burst of damage. Again, we're just testing if they had the damage to clear it before the boss recovers, and not necessarily their clear times. This is because with a consistent crit, the speed is highly affected by the amount of times they crit. And of course, I'm no expert on Klee either. I could have probably done it cleaner, so go easy on me on the comments. At the very least, we can now conclude that Hu Tao is in fact a very strong Pyro DPS. When it comes to damage, Hu Tao is easily the best Pyro DPS right now. The reason why I tested out and compared their damage is actually for one reason alone, to let you see the kind of damage that they can potentially do relative to each other. The current state of Genshin Impact is all about time attacks, so Hu Tao has absolutely earned a spot in the top DPS ladder. However, when it comes to DPS characters, there's more to it than just big damage. You also have to look at the lesser issue of flexibility and survivability, and also ease of use. For the next part, we'll be discussing Hu Tao's strengths and weaknesses, and compare this with Diluc and Klee, as well as give you some tips to improve your experience with Hu Tao. I'll show you clips of gameplay of the three for you to better understand what I'll be discussing. We'll be talking about it mainly from Hu Tao's perspective, while focusing on her C0 traits. As you've seen in the first part of this video, Hu Tao is the very definition of a big damaged character. Hu Tao focuses on huge bursts and is therefore a burst DPS character. Klee is better off as a sustained DPS, especially before C4, and while Diluc is mostly used as a sustained DPS character, you can use him as a burst DPS since he does have a higher multiplier on his elemental burst. Based on my experiences, Hu Tao excels the most at single target damage due to limited options on actual high damage AoE, and her basic moveset AoE pales in comparison to Klee's and Diluc's. And while her elemental burst does cover a small radius around her, Diluc's Phoenix can be used as a long-range nuke, and Klee's elemental skill can be used as a hit-and-run tactic that covers more AoE than Hu Tao's burst. Damage-wise, however, her normal attack and charge attack are pretty equal to the other two, but her elemental burst has the highest damage multiplier among all the Pyro characters to date. When not using her elemental burst, Hu Tao's main damage comes from her charge attack, similar to Klee, but the difference is that she needs her elemental skill to actually deal damage. Her elemental skill is a temporary buff that gives her a ton of attack, and the more you pump up the talent level, the more attack you'll gain due to the increased scaling from her HP. At level 8 talents and 30k HP, I can pretty much come close to 3k attack, even with a 4-star weapon. As a comparison, Diluc with Wolf's Gravestone and Attack Sands can hit 2.5k attack, but since Hu Tao uses HP Sands to make the most of her skill scaling, she pretty much needs her skill active to deal damage, otherwise her attack's going to be pretty low. And to top it off, Pyro DPS characters are very strong due to Pyro's very strong elemental reactions. But the only time Hu Tao has Pyro damage is during her burst and when her elemental skill is up. So her skill is pretty much a requirement to deal damage. This is different from Klee, who deals purely Pyro damage, and Diluc, who can use his E on short cooldown. On top of having a long duration, Pyro infused effect from his elemental burst that has the shortest cooldown among all 3 bursts. Without her skill, Hu Tao's effectiveness drops significantly, and you'll absolutely notice it since the cooldown on the elemental skill is quite long. Her elemental burst also has a high cooldown compared to Diluc with the lowest cooldowns, although Klee has the longest cooldowns among all 3 DPS. As for energy, Hu Tao can generate particles by hitting enemies during her skill's duration, so having a battery is not that necessary, although helpful, and this is true for Klee and Diluc as well. You may want to swap to other characters during Hu Tao's skill's downtime, since downtimes are effectively a DPS loss. So setting up proper supports or even a burst character to swap to when her skill is on cooldown can tremendously increase your overall DPS. Hu Tao's passive and burst lets her deal more damage while below 50% HP. So you'll have to consider the timing of using her burst, whether you want to make the most of it or not. If you're used to dodging or are running defensive supports, there are times such as in the Abyss where you'll have her elemental burst but no way to drop below 50% HP without using her elemental skill. Dropping below 50% HP only requires 2 uses of her skill, but you'll still have to wait out the timers unless you want to take damage on purpose. You'll have to make the decision between more damage and heals or simply using the elemental burst while having more than 50% HP, which can sometimes feel like a waste because nobody wants to deal less damage when they can deal more, although she'll still do more damage than Diluc and Klee. As for the other two, they have the freedom to use their burst whenever they want, and the damage remains consistent, though Klee has the issue of spreading damage across multiple targets and over a certain period of time, unlike Diluc and Hu Tao's instant damage. Hu Tao's low HP playstyle can also bring a small dilemma of whether or not to bring healers, but I've had runs in the Abyss where I only run Hu Tao and shield supports with enough success. Keep in mind as well that Klee is the squishiest one out of the 3, but Hu Tao can easily end up on the floor if you're not careful. She also has stamina issues to keep track of if you want to take advantage of the high multipliers from her charge attacks. This is something you'll have to keep in mind with Hu Tao, especially in more difficult battles where you'll have to dodge enemy attacks or run away, or even close gaps with enemies that have been knocked away. Not having stamina when you need to dodge is another easy way to end up on the floor. Klee faces a similar stamina micromanagement issue, but Klee's passive helps mitigate some of her stamina problems. The only way to improve this for Hu Tao is with C1, where she can use charge attacks without stamina during her skill duration. As for Diluc, stamina isn't really a concern since he doesn't actually need to use charge attacks. Even if he isn't exactly tanky either, he'll have an easier time to dodge compared to the two. While there are still many more details and nuances to compare, at the end of the day, you don't need Hu Tao if you have Diluc or Klee. At the very least, they haven't gotten replaced entirely, at least not at C0. When it comes to pure damage, however, Hu Tao is undoubtedly the number one pyro DPS at the moment. Diluc would be the most versatile character since he can do everything, and Klee would be the hardest option to play, but doesn't lose out in terms of damage and versatility. If you need a pyro DPS, or simply enjoy using pyro characters, Hu Tao is one you do not want to miss. I hope this video gave you a good idea of how Hu Tao compares to the other two pyro DPS at C0, and if there's anything I missed or if you have any feedback, you can let me know in the comments down below. And here are all the builds used in this video. You can pause the video to check out every single one of them in more detail. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.